The US had no overarching long-range plan to create a political empire. Instead, policymakers initially emphasized commercial growth. In the 1880s, Secretary of State James G. Blaine explained, quote, "Our great demand is expansion," end quote. He noted, however, that this did not mean annexation of territory, but rather annexation of trade. But a decade of aggressive foreign policy intent on expanding and protecting the nation's global commercial empire, coupled with the crises of the 1890s, paved the way for the establishment of a political empire. First asserting dominance in the Western Hemisphere, U.S. policymakers soon defined the nation's strategic interests broadly and forcefully in the Pacific and Asia as well. The 3-month-long Spanish-American-Philippine War in 1898 paid huge dividends to the U.S. Entered into with limited aims, ostensibly to aid Cuban independence and defend American business interests, the war resulted in control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Although a latecomer, the U.S., with its modern navy playing a key role, now joined its European and Japanese rivals as participants in the new imperialism. Beginning in the 1880s, the U.S. embarked on a more expansive foreign policy in Latin America to protect markets and American investments there. Secretary of State James Blaine, who served under Republican Presidents James Garfield and Benjamin Harrison, was the chief architect of this new policy, which would last well into the 20th century. Blaine asserted that the U.S. must maintain stability in Latin America to guarantee healthy trade and to secure its markets. In 1890, Blaine played a key role in Congress's passage of the first major reciprocal tariff. This legislation allowed certain goods from Latin America, such as sugar, coffee, and hides, to enter the country with no tariff as long as Latin American countries allowed the free passage of U.S. goods in return. Trade with Cuba and Brazil exploded as a result. Subsequent administrations embraced Blaine's policy. Interference in the internal affairs of Latin American countries and even military intervention soon resulted. In 1893, for instance, when Brazilian monarchists encouraged by the British threatened to revolt against the recently established pro-American Republican regime, President Grover Cleveland helped quash the revolution at the behest of U.S. business interests. Venezuela emerged as a trouble spot a few years later, in 1895-96. A long-disputed border between Venezuela and British Guiana catalyzed American intervention when Great Britain reasserted its claims to territory that included the gateway to trade for much of the continent. Citing the Monroe Doctrine, President Cleveland insisted that the British arbitrate the disputed land claim. When Great Britain ignored his request, an angry Cleveland explained that not only would the U.S. enforce the Monroe Doctrine in the dispute, but it would also resist by every means in its power Britain's Venezuelan claims. Great Britain, caving into U.S. demands, ultimately lost its territorial claims as arbiters sided with Venezuela and the U.S. reinforced its dominance in the Western Hemisphere. The U.S. also engaged in muscular foreign policy beyond the Caribbean. Asserting itself in the Pacific, it protected business interests established earlier by American missionaries and traders. In 1875, the American-dominated government of Hawaii had established a reciprocity agreement with the U.S. that allowed Hawaiian sugar to enter the nation duty-free. This resulted in the tripling of sugar production in 10 years. But the McKinley Tariff, passed by Congress in 1890, ended Hawaii's favored status and threatened the sugar industry there. Immediately, Americans in Hawaii began to pursue annexation to the U.S. as a solution to support their export problems. As the Hawaiian economy nearly collapsed, Queen Lulukalani threatened American domination when she ascended to the throne upon her brother's death in 1891. 4 years earlier, Americans in Hawaii had implemented a new constitution, referred to by Native Hawaiians as the, quote, Bayonet Constitution. It limited the political power of natives and their monarchy. In 1893, the Queen, intent on returning control of the islands to her people, now a minority in their own country, drew up another constitution that restored the power of the monarchy and returned political rights to Native Hawaiians. But American missionary planter interests, headed by Stanford B. Dole, organized a coup and overthrew the Queen. At their request, supported by the U.S. minister in Hawaii, the American government dispatched Marines to prevent the Queen and her supporters from fighting back. Americans wanted Cuba for many years before the 1890s. The crown jewel of the Spanish Empire in the Caribbean, Cuba was but 90 miles off the coast of South Florida. Before the Civil War, pro-slavery advocates discussed annexing the island, and, beginning in the 1830s, American investors such as the Atkins family of Boston engaged in the sugar trade, providing credit to sugar planters. After the Civil War, these investors became planters themselves. In 1882, E. Atkins and Company of Boston emerged as the largest landowner on the islands. Cubans, who had long chafed under Spanish rule and had instigated numerous unsuccessful rebellions, launched yet another revolution against Spain in the 1890s. In 1894, U.S. tariff agreements granting Hawaiian sugar favored status plunged Cubans into an economic crisis. Economic collapse and unemployment only served to remind Cubans of their lack of political power. In February 1895, Cuban insurgents took advantage of widespread discontent and began to fight against Spanish authorities. By 1896, revolutionaries, under the banner of Cuba Libre, took their fight to the countryside. Torching sugar fields, they vowed that there would be no peace, production, or protection of property until Spain granted independence. Intent on holding on to the last jewel in its once expansive necklace of colonies, Spain attempted to crush the rebellion with an iron fist. Led by General Valeriano Weyler, who proclaimed, quote, "I believe that war should be answered with war," end quote, Spain increased its army to 200,000 men. Weyler realized that he could quash the rebellion only by suffocating the rural, peasant communities that provided support to the rebels. In the fall of 1896, in an attempt to snuff out the rebellion, he formulated a new policy, reconcentration, ordering the rural population to move to designated, fortified areas under Spanish control. Spanish soldiers also burned villages, food supplies, and peasant fields, slaughtered animals, and destroyed any resource that could aid the insurgents. Weyler's policies created hundreds of thousands of refugees, and tens of thousands of sick and hungry Cubans perished. Developments in Cuba quickly captured the attention of Americans. The rebellion and scorched earth tactics of both sides threatened American investments, which were estimated at $15 million on the island at the start of the war. Many also feared that Cuba might easily be plucked from Spain by a much more powerful European rival. Major newspapers, especially those owned by William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, competed for readers by publishing sensational front-page stories that described atrocities in Cuba. Yellow journalism, as it was dubbed, named after a popular comic strip character named the Yellow Kid, provoked widespread public support for Cuban rebels. Vivid, often fabricated stories portrayed the brutal policies of, quote, Butcher Weyler. Newspapers cried out for American military intervention on behalf of the insurgents. Despite wide-ranging concerns, neither the Democratic Cleveland administration in its final year when the revolution exploded in 1895-96, nor the subsequent Republican administration of William McKinley acted hastily. Rather than jump into war, McKinley sought a diplomatic solution to the Cuban crisis. In 1897, his first year in office, he demanded that Spain implement reforms to end the Cuban revolt. Spain complied by removing Weyler, declaring amnesty to insurgents, and establishing a liberal government that granted Cuba partial independence. But halfway measures only angered Spanish loyalists and those seeking independence. The crisis in Cuba worsened as the Spanish lost control. When riots by Spanish loyalists tore through Havana in late 1897, McKinley ordered the battleship USS Maine to Havana Harbor to protect American citizens and property. February 15th, 1898, the Maine blew up in Havana Harbor, killing 260 of 276 American soldiers aboard the ship. Most Americans immediately concluded, as did Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt, that the explosion was an act of, quote, dirty treachery on the part of the Spanish, end quote. A hastily convened Naval Board of Inquiry conducted an investigation and concluded that a detonated mine had destroyed the ship. The public clamored even more loudly for war, declaring, quote, remember the Maine, to hell with Spain, end quote. On April 11, 1898, after attempting a final diplomatic solution, McKinley asked Congress for a declaration of war against Spain, which it passed unanimously. The nation embarked on its war with Spain in a near holiday spirit. As men responded enthusiastically to McKinley's call for troops and eagerly embraced the chance to fight, women organized relief associations to support the troops. But the nation found itself unprepared for war, and logistical problems plagued the campaign. Many soldiers, for instance, never received proper equipment or training. They lacked even the most basic necessities, such as tents and mess kits. In addition, the government issued standard wool uniforms, unsuitable for a summer war in a tropical climate. As soldiers gathered in Tampa, Florida, to embark for Cuba, Commodore George Dewey scored the first American victory of the war on the other side of the globe. In February 1898, 10 days after the Maine explosion, Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt ordered Dewey to engage the Spanish in the Pacific colony, the Philippines, should war break. On May 1st, Dewey defeated the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay without losing a single man. The Philippines had hardly figured into the discussion leading up to the war, which focused on freeing Cuba from Spanish rule. But with the China market endangered in 1898, the U.S. immediately expanded its war against Spain to include the strategically located Philippines. As Captain Mahan noted a few months after Dewey's victory, quote, the port of Manila is very centrally situated as regards the whole sweep of the eastern coast of Asia, end quote. By late June, the first American ground troops arrived in Manila. On August 12, 1898, the Spanish signed a protocol of peace ending the war after only 3 months. Within that short time, U.S. war aims had expanded considerably. American troops had not only defeated the Spanish in Cuba and Manila Bay, but they had also seized Guam and Puerto Rico. In July 1898, just as the war heated up, Congress approved the annexation of Hawaii. On August 14th, 2 days after Spain agreed to end the war, but before word of the war's end reached the Philippines, American troops, with the aid of Filipino rebels, captured the city of Manila. In a matter of weeks, the U.S. had substantially extended its influence and power in the Pacific and Asia. As Captain Mahan had predicted, naval power proved to be the key to American victory and world standing. In Cuba, U.S. war aims changed from a war of liberation into a war of conquest. Despite its high-toned language on behalf of Cuban independence, the American War Declaration did not recognize the rebels or their provisional government, as the U.S. remained intent on controlling the war and its aftermath. Refusing to allow the rebels to take an active part in the war against Spain, military leaders as well as journalists increasingly depicted them in negative racial stereotypes. They seemed surprised that many Cubans were dark-skinned and African in descent. One officer described them as, quote, lazy, cowardly, dirty, and childlike, clearly incapable of self-government. The Treaty of Paris, signed in December 1898, officially ended the war with Spain pending Senate ratification. Spain ceded Cuba and Puerto Rico in the Caribbean and Guam and the Philippines for an additional $20 million in the Pacific. The war proved to be a stunning debut for a nation as a world power.